Welcome to Love Data Week and happy Valentine's Day. I'm Jennifer Moore. I'm the head of data services, and I'm going to moderate the panel this afternoon. Love Data Week is an international event. Here at WashU, it's brought to you through a collaboration between the University Libraries, Becker Medical Library, and the Institute for Informatics. We'll have events all week. We've already had a few of those, including our keynote yesterday from Lauren Klein, the author of Data Feminism. And another companion panel is coming later this week. It will be held at the medical school, and it will be asking these same questions, but with a biomedical focus. There are flyers around if you want to snap the QR code and register for that panel. So in this time of digital transformation and interdisciplinary foci on our campus, finding common ground in our research is essential, as is articulating the significance of distinct approaches to data. This year's Love Data Week theme, My Kind of Data, resonates at WashU, and so we've brought together researchers from different areas to discuss their data via a set of panels. And as I mentioned, there's another one coming at the medical school on Friday. Today we'll hear perspectives from three of our faculty from this campus, from the Humanities, Life Sciences, and Social Sciences. They'll describe how they engage with data, and I'll now introduce the panelists. First of all, and not in their sitting order, in the center, we have Rachel Penczykowski, an assistant professor in the biology department. She is a disease ecologist who is broadly interested in how environmental factors impact host-parasite interactions and how parasitism impacts ecosystems. She's worked with both aquatic and terrestrial systems and also uses mathematical modeling to explore general mechanisms by which environmental change and disease interact. Her lab currently uses common weedy plants and their fungal pathogens as the primary study system for empirical research. Major questions they're asking concern impacts of climate change and urbanization on ecology and evolution of plant diseases. At the end, we have Ariella Schachter. She is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and associate director of the Wiedenbaum Center here. She's currently engaged in research addressing public attitudes towards immigrants, racial ethnic relations, neighborhood selection, and residential inequality. Professor Schachter primarily uses experiments and causal inference methods. More recently, she has begun using big data and computational text analysis in her work. And finally, nearest to me is Jeff Ward, professor of African and African American Studies and a faculty affiliate in Sociology and American Cultural Studies. He's also director of the WashU and Slavery Project, an initiative based in the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, CRE2, and part of the global consortium of universities studying slavery. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And now, we've asked our panelists to discuss challenges they face in planning, collecting, managing, and sharing data through the research life cycle, and discuss how they overcome or navigated through those challenges. So we've prepared some questions for our panelists, and we invite you to ask your questions at the end. And I'll begin firstly with you each introducing with about a 5-minute span of time introducing your research and your data in a sort of broad way. And we'll start at the end this time. So Ariella, will you kick us off?
Is this on? Yeah, okay, perfect. Hi, so I'm Ariella. My research is looking at a couple of different questions. First, how do Americans think about and react to immigrants in their communities and in our broader society? And I tend to address that question mostly using survey experiments. And so that's where we will manipulate the information that people are being presented as part of the questions that they're answering in surveys, and they don't necessarily know that different people are seeing different information across the surveys. And so we're able to use that to get some leverage over, say, for example, are people more positive when they view the profile of an immigrant in the US who speaks fluent English and has a master's degree and is from India compared to an immigrant with different levels of education, different levels of English language ability, maybe different legal status, different country of origin, right? So we do that to try to get away from the fact that if you just said to someone like, so how do you feel about Latinx immigrants in the US, right? They might feel like there's some bias around what they're supposed to tell you versus how they actually feel. And so by using randomization and manipulating these profiles and having people not fully realize everything that's kind of happening across the different surveys that different respondents are getting, we're able to get some traction over that and try to get them to kind of reveal their truer attitudes and beliefs. So that's one strand of research that I do. Another is using a similar approach in terms of survey experiments, but looking at how do people practice racial classification in the United States. So these, I think, are really actually related questions, right? So how people kind of react and thinking about different groups and immigrant groups is deeply tied to race and racism and white supremacy in the United States. And again, hard to get people if you just kind of go up to them and ask them their attitudes to necessarily be upfront and honest with you. So that's another question, and again, mostly using survey experiments for that. And then the last kind of big project I'm working on is looking at neighborhoods and residential selection and thinking about racial segregation in the United States, and specifically in cities and metropolitan areas across the US. And that's using a combination of survey experiments, but also web scraping and text analysis. So for the last several years, we've been collecting data from Craigslist, from the 50 largest rental markets across the United States. And using that, so we have millions and millions and millions of observations of ads for rental housing across different cities, different neighborhoods within those cities, and we're using that data to try to understand, are there patterns in how people talk about and advertise housing across neighborhoods that that are kind of tied to the neighborhood's demographic composition? And maybe not a surprise, right, based on what I've just been saying in my research and so, but there are highly racialized patterns. And while it's illegal to market housing and use racial terms, talk about national origin, right? That's all illegal under our fair housing laws. It's not illegal to talk about the criminal record checks you're going to do. It's not illegal to talk about other kind of ways you're going to evaluate a candidate's or potential renter's background. It's not illegal to advertise in Spanish, and these are all, as we're finding and showing in our experiments, these are all coded language that people see in ads and use to infer the racial composition of the neighborhood, or at least what they think it is, right? And based on that, they then also think they know, the quality of the schools in the neighborhood, the crime rate in the neighborhood, the incomes of people who live in that neighborhood, and that drives how desirable they see it as a place to live. And so that project is exciting to me because it's really, I'm trying to think about how can these kind of big data, text analysis, computational techniques, which we're mostly applying to observational data, right, that we're not manipulating and that we can't necessarily say what causes changes in that data, but applying it and putting it in conversation with the kind of survey experiment framework that I've been using for a longer amount of time to try to think, how can we make survey experiments more generalizable, right? So how can they be kind of better reflections of what's actually happening in the real world outside of a survey that you might get asked to take, and how can we bring more causality into our analysis of these kind of observed big data that's really rich and descriptive and tells us what's happening, but not necessarily why and what it causes.
Thank you. Rachel?
All right, thank you. So, like was mentioned in the introduction, I study infectious diseases from an ecological and evolutionary perspective. And in my lab, a lot of our big questions have to do with climate change impacts on infectious disease, as well as other types of environmental change, like land use change. And so some of the types of data that we collect and approaches that we use a lot of them include field-based methods and what we call survey methods, although these are not asking the plants questions. They are more teams of researchers going out and collecting observational data about the infection status, the size, and other information about plants. Typically geospatial data, so we will either collect a lot of information from a lot of different populations spanning broad environmental variation, or sometimes really fine-scale data on individual plants within a population. So some of the questions that we're interested in involve large-scale differences in climate and how that relates to patterns of fungal disease on plants. And then some of our questions relate to very fine-scale differences in climate, like what you would see between the shade of a tree and full sun within a population. And so some of the questions that we're interested in have to do with just how will climate warming change the frequency and severity of plant diseases. And then other questions have to do with specifics of pathogen life cycles. And for example, for the particular fungus that we study, it switches between asexual and sexual reproduction, which means that sometimes it's producing clonally, and other times it's reproducing through genetic recombination and making new novel offspring variants of that fungus. And it turns out that mechanism of reproduction is linked to temperature. And so we are studying across or along a large latitudinal gradient variation in the frequency of pathogen sexual reproduction and what that means for genetic diversity. So that means, in addition to just information about where the plants are, how infected they are, we're also collecting samples, doing molecular analyses on the plants and the pathogens. And so we generate increasingly large amounts of sequence data in my lab. And we also do experiments, both field experiments where we grow plants of particular origins in the greenhouse here at WashU, and then either continue studying them in that greenhouse context or bring them out into field populations and transplant them and see how plants from a particular place grow in another place and vice versa. And this allows us to study patterns of adaptation of the plants to different climate or different land use context. So some of our work here in St. Louis involves studying, comparing urban, suburban, and rural plant populations, because we know that there are a whole bunch of different environmental factors that are altered by conversion of land into urban areas. And so we study both the urban heat island effect, so the warmer temperatures in cities, as well as various other aspects of change to the soil, change to proximity to roads, and other things that matter to the chemical and physical environment that the plants and their diseases experience. And so the experimental data and field collected data, like I mentioned, tend to be quite geospatial. The genetic data that we collect is kind of increasingly big data in our lab. And then we also need to be able to characterize the environment itself. And so we have one project that's really based on measuring temperature on the ground in different contexts across different levels of urbanization and different types of habitat within those sites. And so we are interested in fine-scale variation in temperature, say in a tall grass prairie plantings in a park, compared to a stand of trees in that same park, compared to a large mowed open area, and comparing those types of habitat sites across broader land use change, and then putting that together with sophisticated climate modeling done by some collaborators to understand that variation in on-the-ground temperatures and how it relates to predictions of temperature.
Thank you. Jeff?
So I've been doing research for a long time, and this has led to working with data, all kinds of different data, and working with it in different ways. And it's funny, I'm grouped as, I'm sort of categorized as a humanist here because my PhD's in sociology, but my practice, my sociological practice looks more humanistic, I would say, than is typical of sociologists. but I wasn't really trained to do that, work, the kind of work I ended up doing. So my training was more around, statistical analysis and survey data research. But like most researchers, I've been drawn to data that have potential to speak to the questions, the problems I'm really interested in. And so early on, that led me to kind of teaching myself how to do archival research. And because I was interested in studying the racial history of American juvenile justice. And it's a longer story about kind of how that unfolded. But, I had intended to do a kind of quantitative analysis of the use of, I think mostly using survey data, of the use of these actuarial tools that courts adopted called risk and need assessment instruments that were touted as reducing bias in the administration of justice, systematic, filling out these forms and to produce results. And I was going to do a little bit of a background on race and juvenile justice. I thought it was going to be a page or two. And it ended up being the focus of my whole dissertation and a later book I wrote. But two things I want to say about that. One is I realized just how naive I was about the racial history of juvenile justice and how little had been written about it. So I committed to sort of developing more of a contribution there, and that led me into the archives to find records, both archival institutional records, institutional historical records of institutions like courts and carceral institutions that would help me document the experiences of African Americans in particular, African American youth in these early systems that go back to the 19th century, who were invisible in all of the published research on the early history of juvenile justice. And also, I was really more so interested in the experiences and the interventions of black adults in the development of American juvenile justice, which really led me to focus on the history of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which, and all this is very iterative. I'm learning, there's this group called the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and they have these state chapters and these local chapters, and they were really, from beginning of the 1880s, really committed to dismantling what they saw as this emerging Jim Crow juvenile justice system. So that just led me down all kinds of paths, and literally my apartment in grad school filled up with these piles of random documents that were data. They were my data that I was using to piece together the story, the unwritten racial history of American juvenile justice. And I didn't know what to do with them. So I decided to get a big sketch pad from the art store and just manually enter the things I had found on a timeline, and with some categorical descriptions, and see if a story emerged from that. And in fact, that really helped me make sense analytically of what I was finding. So I've had a lot of those kinds of experiences. That project really got me interested in the legacy of racial violence, in part because really two pieces of research that came out of that, main areas of research. One was the legacy, the arc of racial violence. See, the women I was writing about, predominantly black women, are mobilizing. They recognized this as an institution that was projecting into the future collective black economic and political and social disadvantage by withholding from black youth and, by extension, communities equal access to opportunities for self-realization and social mobility and so on. So they called this, they thought of it as a genocidal institution. And I thought that made me interested sociologically in how racial violence travels forward. And which, as I was thinking more about that, I learned that there was at the time a very small body of research on the legacy of historical racial violence, which I thought was really interesting and surprising. The studies were showing that histories of lynching and other racialized violence predict subsequent patterns of conflict and violence and inequality in communities today. So I became really interested in contributing to that research, and I did that in a number of ways I'll come back to in a second. The other thing I was that early work made me interested in was this idea that the activists I was writing about had, that if there was more racial ethnic group representation among legal authorities, there'd be more, it would institutionalize equal justice. And I thought that was an important, interesting theoretical and empirical question, so I started researching representation in the justice workforce, and that led me to working with different sorts of data, like surveys to look at attitudinal differences among legal professionals, and also court data, sentencing data, and building data sets that allowed you to compare court organizations with more or less diversity in their outcomes, that sort of thing. So I did a number of studies along those lines. But I really became focused in the legacies of racial violence work, and so started doing just some basic research with existing data, on the existing data that are sort of most routinely been utilized are records of historic lynching at the county level, and those records are, I started both using them analytically, but also studying the history of that data collecting, and the work of people like Ida B. Wells and Monroe work at Tuskegee, who were determined to not allow these atrocities to go undocumented. And Ida B. Wells' famous pamphlet, The Red Record, which was just discussed in the previous session on the Douglas Day Transcribathon. Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells were contemporaries who worked together. So I became really, the thing I want to say about those data are they're very limited in terms of the history of race-related political violence. Lynching was a very specific form, a terrible specific form of racialized violence, but there was all kind of racialized violence historically that is theoretically related to these legacies I was talking about. So this got me onto this really crazy scheme to really build a more comprehensive racial violence archive, and to try to pull more of the record of racialized political violence together, to look at more systematically how these histories, what happened, but also what we can learn from them. And the last thing I'll say for now about all that is our most recent, so we recently were funded to study, one of the problems with the legacies of racial violence work is that it is very much county bound because of the way data are structured. It's hard to make sense of how an event in one place relates to outcomes in other places. We don't have good data on, we know that many populations were displaced by these events, for example, and came to places like St. Louis, but we don't have good data on who those people are, where they came from, and what kinds of outcomes they've experienced over generations. So one of the ways where David Cunningham and I have worked together on a lot of this, David is in sociology here, and we've recently gotten a grant with some colleagues in computer science and digital humanities at other institutions who've developed methods for analyzing historical newspapers using computational methods and text mining and to understand networks of reporting. And so we're starting a project now using historical newspaper data to try to understand the virality of racial terror, how stories about racial terror spread, and how that spread through reporting might relate to the spread of the historical trauma and so forth as well. And it's very early on, and here again, I basically know very little about how to do any of this. But this has been a big story. This has been part of my life with data. I've been very good at finding people who know how to do things and want to do things that I don't necessarily know how to do or want to do, and find ways to work together to glean insights from the data.
Well, that was a lovely segue to my next question, which is when you're thinking about developing a new project or grant and you have to decide what data you need for that project, how does that determination come about? Who's involved in making those decisions? Who's on the team? What skills are needed? Talk to us about how that process happens, and especially when you're working outside of your discipline. So I don't know, Jeff, you're probably tired, even though you led us to that segue, but we'll give you a little break, and Rachel, you can go ahead and take this one.
Sure. I personally am really drawn to tricky interdisciplinary types of questions, and I love meeting other experts who can bring their expertise into the equation. So it's a part of my job as a research scientist that I really love very much, is the connecting to other folks who are way more experts on many things than I am, because I think the truth of the matter is to a lot of these questions that all three of us are asking are very complex and tricky, and it would be kind of absurd to imagine that any one person is going to have all of the expertise needed to guide all of the different facets of it. And so I would say bringing together the team is a really critical part of my research. And so in the example that I shared about our climate data and climate modeling integration, I'm not a climate modeler. And so we had to find experts. In this case, we found Dr. Fengpeng Sun at University of Missouri, Kansas City, who does a particular type of dynamical downscaling of climate models that really helps connect from big scale climate models to the finer scale types of measurements that we collect as ecologists in the field. And so their lab doesn't do any of that on the ground collecting. Our lab does a lot of it. And so part of the, I think, fun challenge is sharing with each other about those differences in methodologies and some of the practical issues that both of us might have. Theirs in terms of computational power needed, and how time intensive and expensive it will be to run certain very complex simulations, and then from our side of it, how many types of high quality data, temperature and humidity sensors can we purchase with a reasonable grant fund, and where would we decide to put them that is both environmentally motivated in terms of the research questions that we're asking, but also feasible in terms of the logistics of where do you have permission to do your work in a field population. And so there's different constraints on both sides of that particular research partnership. But I think bringing together the right team of people for the particular questions that you're trying to answer is absolutely critical, and certainly has to be done at the beginning of conceiving of a grant idea. Once you have the question, then it becomes all about really figuring out what are those types of data that you need, and then who can you invite to join you in the quest for those data, and in particular the analyses of those data, which can be sometimes a whole other ball game than collecting the data themselves.
Ariella?
Yeah, it's like so interesting to get to have a chance to reflect on the process, right? Because most of the time I'm just so busy trying to get things done, I don't even get to pause. So I think the project I was talking about that uses the Craigslist data is a great example. So I was finishing grad school at Stanford, so living in the Bay Area, and moving all the time because my rent was always going up and my grad student stipend was the same. And I could never afford to live anywhere. And so I was often browsing housing websites like Craigslist, Zillow, and just in my own personal life, looking for somewhere to live that I could afford. And I started noticing in certain neighborhoods, I'm seeing all these ads posted in Spanish, even though Craigslist is an English language website. And gee, it makes me think about who might these who might the landlord be? Who might they be thinking might want to live here? Who else lives in this neighborhood? Would I fit here with someone else, right? And like these like sociological questions that were tied into my dissertation research, which was really focusing on immigration and racial attitudes and not so much about like neighborhoods and housing. And I went to a research conference and I was talking with a friend who I had met as an admitted student visiting graduate programs, and we ended up going to different PhD programs. But he is an urban sociologist whose entire research agenda focuses on urban neighborhoods in the United States. And I was telling him about this idea, and he was like, "Oh well, I can, I'm happy to like help you with the literature review as you kind of like get up to scale on this." And I was like, "Well, we should just work on it together because I don't know all of this literature very well." And that's how we started. And I got here as a new assistant professor, and I was like, I'm going to figure out how to do this. And immediately ran into a bunch of roadblocks with my own technical skills, and looked around. And at the time, the sociology department at WashU was brand new. So I was in the second year of faculty who were hired. So there were like 6 of us total. There was no PhD program. We didn't have graduate students here yet in sociology who could join me as research assistants on the project. And so I reached out to colleagues in political science who I knew were using some of the research methods that I was thinking would be relevant for this project, and was like, hey, do you have any great grad students who I could like pay and steal away to come work with me? And luckily they sent me one who is now an amazing assistant professor of political science herself, and she helped me figure out how to start scraping the data. And like, I had never done anything like this before, and it was just really like, I just like knew it could happen, but I didn't really know how to do it. And it was then finding this person who had these great skills, and she also had all of these ideas herself. So her research was looking at using computer vision to think about, like, for example, in media coverage of protests, are the images that are covering certain types of protests featuring violence more often than images of other types of protests, and how might those images then be shaping political attitudes and opinion and support for different types of protests and different, political issues in the United States. And she was like, oh, well, like the pictures that people are posting with housing might also be interesting. And right, like all of these ideas that kind of were just part of the research data exploration process, I guess, that kind of worked their way in various ways into the project. And working with her led me to finding a postdoc to recruit to the project who also happened to have his training in political science, even though as a sociologist, right, like the questions I thought were sociological, but he saw how they could fit into his own work on race and inequality and politics in the United States. And it kind of just kept evolving from there in terms of getting a grant from National Science Foundation to support the work. And, I think I was listening to Jeff, I was thinking, oh, like I'm kind of in between, because I do actually, one of the things I love about being, a researcher is like that I get to learn new data analysis and research methods as I go. And sometimes I think like that's not maybe the smartest approach to building a career in academia, because like it takes a long time to develop expertise in any one, analytical approach, working with any one type of data. And like that's what we are then supposed to get known for, like being really good at that one thing. And I just keep wanting to learn more of them. So that's kind of the process that I've been taking, as a combination of trying to learn new methods enough myself to at least understand like what they can and can't do and what they're good at, even if I then need to turn to someone who has higher technical expertise to implement them. I think for me, at least, it's hard if I don't understand enough about the method to like know its capabilities to think about how I can incorporate it into my work. And that's been my process so far. And I think some of the exciting, new developments that are happening across campus with triads and the incubator that has a longer name, but I'm not sure if I can get it correct, so I won't say it right now. Right, is like bringing in various ways people with different technical skills, both across different departments and schools at WashU, but also bringing in more like software developers who can work with faculty to develop their research and kind of take it in new directions.
Thank you, Jeff.
I think like Ariella was saying, I think there's a lot of chance encounter and also, opportunism. I don't mean that in a negative way at all. Just noticing, like, there's something here. Maybe we can do something with this, and then taking the leap. taking a bit of a leap of faith to, share your harebrained scheme of someone, or and very often those go nowhere, as you all know. But sometimes they do really manifest in interesting, important ways. It's funny. I was thinking about how David Cunningham and I met, who I mentioned. We've done a lot of work together now over the years. But we met randomly, and we at a meeting in Mississippi in 2007, where we were both invited to come to this meeting. That wasn't about research. It was about an effort to create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Mississippi. And we were both sort of, invited. I was a new assistant professor at Northeastern in Boston, and one of the lead organizers was a law professor at Northeastern named Margaret Burnham. And she said, I think she said to me, Jeff, you need some other ideas, interests, because you're always talking about this juvenile justice stuff. Everything's juvenile justice. Everything. Da, 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 da. You should come to this meeting, because I know you're interested in historical stuff. You should come to this meeting and, whatever. So I'm like, okay, that sounds cool. So we go to Tougaloo College for this meeting, and David's there. He'd also been in Boston at Brandeis in the sociology faculty. We had never met. But we were, I think, about 2 or 3, there were, probably about 20, 30 people in these meetings, and 2 or 3 of us were social researchers. Including David and I. So we just started talking. We said, during the meeting, we said maybe one way we could help this effort would be to just sort of step out of it some and just do basic research on the history of racist violence in Mississippi that awaits, a truth-telling and bearing witness and reckoning. And that would be a way to support the effort that is underway here. So we wrote a proposal to a foundation to study racialized violence in Mississippi and North Carolina over a period of years. And we didn't tell it wasn't in the grant that this is about, supporting the efforts of this Truth and Reconciliation effort. It was, couched in all the advancing knowledge and new, blah, blah, blah. And that's really where that whole line of collaborative work started. In that chance encounter and the opportunity that we noticed in that meeting to merely make a contribution. We weren't really thinking so much about research productivity per se, though we were interested in these questions obviously, and we wanted to do that kind of work. I think in all the grants I've gotten, and I haven't gotten a lot of major grants, but I think most of the grants, in terms of how that relates to the data questions and team building, is just, as people have said, I think it's been, typically a situation where we know we want to work with a certain kind of data around a certain sort of question, and we're looking to match that with what a grant maker is saying they would fund, and we're framing it as framing it in their language, like, oh, you're interested in media literacy, so are we. And we're going to use reporting on racial terror events in newspapers to study media literacy, and we're going to develop exhibitions about that too. And this is to come. I don't know if we've talked yet about this with the libraries, but we did say we would have exhibitions in our libraries at our different institutions about this virality of racial terror work. But yeah, I think it's been, typically, certainly a situation where we've tried to build a team on the front end and get everyone's buy-in and voice in shaping the idea. Though it's also often been the case for various reasons, including wanting to support students, for example, that we've found ways to kind of invite people in, and or things have just not played out as intended, as expected, and you end up needing someone, or learning about something. Like I was thinking about Ariella when you were saying, I'd like to understand the methods. I would too, if I could, but there's like some of them, like David and I did some work with a former graduate student who was really into fuzzy sets, qualitative comparative analysis, which I could basically only remember the name of it, but I never really quite understood what was going on with it, except that it was really a nice break from the sort of linear logic of regression and so on. But he was great at it, and we could collectively tell a story about what these methods were, were revealing for us. But he kind of came on to some of this work later as we had, after we had data that we'd collected, and we were thinking about, well, how do we use this? How do we, how do we answer some particular kinds of questions like, like I was talking about before, this question of diffusion. How does the effect of the historic lynching travel? And we've had all kinds of harebrained schemes. David was for a long time, I think he's sort of gotten off of this now, but he used to always talk about using roads, like if we just need to, if we just quantify the roadways that connect places and add some value measure, then we'll have some matrix for all the people who are connected by place, that went nowhere. That's like one of those examples of things that but that's the kind of thing, that could have led to, and it has potential still, I suppose, but it could have led to some really interesting research and other kind of contribution.
So, listening to you all, I'm hearing you that it sounds like when it comes to generating the data, for the most part, it's a pretty mixed methods approach. I'm hearing big data, I'm hearing remote sensing, I'm hearing archives, I'm hearing, some typical sociology approaches. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the challenges when you're generating data, both in terms of technical, size and maybe tools needed, as well as some more people-centric considerations, so human protections and that sort of thing. And whoever feels moved by the spirit of that question, please feel free to start.
I'm happy to go first.
Okay.
So the easy, typical kind of research approach where I'm doing a survey experiment is usually pretty straightforward. It is human subjects research, and it does need to get approval by IRB, but typically I hire a survey firm to actually recruit the respondents, and I design the survey, and then they field it, and they give me all the answers back. So I don't have any direct contact with the participants, and that tends to make it a pretty straightforward process when it comes to IRB and human subjects considerations, because I don't have any I don't ever actually contact the respondent myself, so I'm not collecting their personal identifying information. There are some issues sometimes where I might want someone's zip code or more detailed location information, which then is considered protected information, but still I don't have direct contact with them, and so it's usually it's not a high burden for me in terms of getting that approved and keeping the data protected. The Craigslist data is not human subjects because it's just public information that people are posting, and sort of in a gray area where so some websites, when we're collecting their data, they have things called an API, which lets you, it's a key, and you can use it, and then they're basically saying we're giving you permission to access our data, and here's the way we want you to do it. Craigslist does not do that, and so we had to design our own script that essentially tries to mimic the behavior of a person just browsing a site and not going too quickly and not, trying to open a bunch of pages very quickly that would look like it was a computer doing it, because that would get Craigslist to block us and say, oh, we think you're one of the competing websites that's trying to make money off of posting rental housing advertisements and stealing our data, even though people are using Craigslist for free. Anyways, so that was not human subjects data, but there are some maybe more legal than ethical considerations, and we basically decided to apologize later if that came up, and so far it hasn't, and hopefully it won't now that we're recording this. Craigslist has sued people before, but only big companies that are trying to monetize their data, and since we're not doing that, I think hopefully it'll continue to be okay. It has so far. This new project I'm working on that I didn't even think about talking about because it's so new, but we've designed a web-based app where we're inviting participants who have an immigrant background, so if they're first or second generation, to share their stories that they can write or record or upload pictures. And then we are inviting anyone, including folks without a migrant background, to view the story. So kind of like if you're familiar with StoryCorps, except we're not having people do interviews, they just kind of submit their own story. But a similar idea of trying to create this platform where people can submit stories about their experiences and then folks can browse them. And the idea is to measure, and we have surveys embedded in the app to measure whether participating in the app and in this platform to share your story can help people with an immigrant background feel more welcomed and included in U.S. society by being given this platform to share, and whether by browsing those stories we can increase more positive and welcoming attitudes among the broader public towards immigrants. And that has been an entirely new set of challenges from a data and research perspective than I've ever encountered before. For one thing, IRB had a lot of concerns about us publishing the stories that people submit and about how we protect their identity, and how if we were recording audio, it could never be considered protected because you could identify someone's voice even if you scrubbed out any actually identifying information, or letting people upload images, and what if it's their face, and how do you know if it's their face or actually someone else's face, and that other person didn't ever consent to be in the project to begin with. So that's been a huge learning experience. There was another barrier because when you're using online platforms, there's a whole other review called information security that goes on, which I only recently learned about myself when I had to get it approved. And they're concerned about the underlying technology and how well data is being encrypted and protected as it's going back and forth from our participants and through the platforms we're using to run the app, which includes a bunch of AI embedded in the app. So for example, when we allow people to dictate and just like record their story on their phone and upload it, we're using AI to automatically transcribe what they said into text. It was important to us that the app be bilingual in English and Spanish, and we're again using AI, so if I record my story in English, the app automatically translates it to Spanish. If I record my story in Spanish, the app automatically translates it to English. It's not perfect, right? If you've used Google Translate, you know it's not perfect, but it's like way better than it used to be. The app also is doing some sentiment analysis, so that's the idea of being able to scan the text that people are submitting or that's been transcribed and then say, like, is this story generally positive or generally negative based on the balance of different types of words in it, and recognize different themes and entities, and flag potentially inappropriate content. So this is brand new, early user was one of my parents who I invited to use the app and give me feedback, and they wrote about the experience of my mom wrote about the experience of her dad fleeing Nazi Germany, and the app flagged it as inappropriate content because it used the word Nazi a bunch of times. So there's some like fine tuning and challenges there. And then the other challenge for me that I've never encountered before is recruiting participants, right? So most of the time I hire a survey firm, I give them money, they give me their respondents, and I don't have to do any work to recruit them. And this new app-based project, that's not the case. I have to find them myself, which is why I had my mom participate. And that's been like a real challenge for me to start figuring out how to do that. I think it's a very typical experience that a lot of other social scientists face all the time and already have lots of great tools to overcome, but a new one for me just based on the type of work that I tend to do.
All right, I'll go next. So one of the big challenges that we face in my line of research are these trade-offs, I guess, between how many different field sites we can study, natural populations of plants that we can survey and collect samples from, and how much information we can get per site. And at a smaller scale, we face the same trade-off at the individual plant level when we do experiments in the greenhouse or in the lab, this trade-off between how many total plants can we have in this experiment and how frequently can we measure them, how many different types of measurements can we take, how many tissue samples can we collect, how many times can we do whatever type of analysis we're doing. And of course it all boils down to what's the question that you're asking and what's the appropriate spatial and temporal scale, but it's always this fine balance of, you get really into it and you say, well, what if we did it, in this many more populations? Surely we can. And then facing the reality of, especially for field work, how many days and person hours, person days can we reasonably spend driving to our sites in the field? What if we'd have bad weather days? All these particular constraints. And so we've tried to get creative in thinking about what types of information we can bring together to really optimize our fieldwork in particular. And so one type of data that's been quite useful comes from a site called iNaturalist, which is a really lovely site where people all over the world who have smartphones or at least cameras and internet access snap photos of organisms, plants and animals alike, and they're geotagged with the location where the photo was taken and a timestamp, and they upload them, and they either attempt to identify the organism themselves or other users in this community of however many thousands of people use this app, millions probably, will identify it for them. And as long as 2 or more people agree on the identification of this plant or animal, then it's considered a research grade identification. And so this has been a useful app for sometimes locating populations of our particular study plants that we can then drive to or ask a collaborator to visit and collect some information or samples from. It also requires some fine tuning, so people are not always correct in their identifications. And so, one thing we did, especially during the first COVID year with undergrads in our lab, was many of them were working on quality control of identifications of the particular organisms that we were interested in. And so that was really useful for refining that data set of these georeference and time-stamped observations. And then we've also been thinking about what types of information can we actually glean from those photographs other than just, there is a plant that exists here in this place at that time. What other attributes of that plant in terms of its development and potentially infection or signs of herbivory that we're interested in can we extract from that photo? And then in our own field work, like I said, we are always faced with this dilemma of how many plants can we count, how much can we write down about those plants while we're out there, and how many sites can we visit per day or per week or per season. And so we did work with a team of engineers here at McKelvey School of Engineering. A class of mechanical engineers built prototypes of a automated plant imager. And then the best prototype was further refined by some independent study students and one of the instructors in the mechanical engineering and material science department. And so now we have a little robot that can take a lot of fine resolution or high resolution images of the ground and our focal study plants, so that we can later, when back in the lab on some rainy day or dreary wintry day, go back and collect a lot more fine scale information about the spatial distribution of those plants and how big are they, what do they look like, things that we just don't have time to do in our core surveys. And so that's been a lot of fun to try to figure out what types of technology and existing types of data that we can use. Of course, with AI, image analysis is just getting amazingly sophisticated, and so we're optimistic about some of those next steps of getting information from photographs of plants being more reliably automatable in the future, rather than with some training by our team. Let's see. We don't have so much the problem of needing to protect plant identities in our work, but I know many colleagues who do, especially if they work on protected species. We intentionally work with very common species that no one cares about, which makes them great for experimental purposes and finding lots and lots of field sites because they're literally weeds. But we do have to think carefully about what are the places that we can visit from a access standpoint. And also from a safety standpoint of our team of researchers. So we have a diverse team of students, undergrads and grad students and postdocs alike, and we want to make sure that the places that we are physically going in the field are places where people are going to be physically safe from many different perspectives, including personal safety with respect to how close to the road do we need to get, as well as issues of policing and by police, as well as policing by neighborhoods. And so we do think carefully about where we are going, who's going where, and whether everyone feels comfortable, and whether we have safety plans in terms of who's going together, what type of identifying information do they have that shows like we're with Wash U plant team and we're wearing bright yellow so we don't get hit by cars, and we've got clipboards that look really official, things like this, because that's obviously the most important thing, is that our team is safe. So that's from the human ethical and safety standpoint. It's much more protecting the researchers than the plants, but also making sure that we have good working relationships at places where we do our research. So a lot of our local research is in parks, and so we do write permits, even for our observational work that's literally like walking through a park and counting things about the plants. We want to make sure that everyone's on board with us being there and they understand what we're doing and that we report back about our findings. And then if we are deploying any sort of equipment for measuring temperature or anything else, then we have to work even be more intentional about making sure that everyone knows what we're doing and we have permission to leave any sampling equipment out.
There are a lot of issues around what you've raised for us on the data side and on the people side. On the data side, I would say the biggest problem, generally speaking, is how our social political structures corrupt the data we're interested in working with and distort them. So, for example, one of the reasons I stopped working so much in the field of criminology and law and society is because I became frustrated by the discipline's unwillingness to deal with the fact that crime data are profoundly corrupted by the politics of crime control. If you think about, for example, the thousands of cases of race-related political violence I've talked about, I'm interested in lynchings and otherwise, very, very few of them were officially documented as crimes. Lynchings by definition involve at least 4 perpetrators. There are at least 5,000 lynchings known to have occurred. So that's 20,000 at least murders that are not part of our archive of murder in the United States. And many of these cases involve hundreds of people aiding and abetting and involved in the cover-up of and the planning of and carrying out of these crimes. But they don't exist as crimes in our records of records of crime. Other more contemporary examples include things like unequal enforcement of drug laws and unequal protection of women in terms of things like sexual assault and domestic violence, other kinds of family violence, that's just not part of our record in terms of crime. And so it becomes a real problem when you're trying to make sense of what's happening using these data. In part, one of the problems is that you run the risk of reifying the racist and sexist logic and so forth of the political, social structure that has structured the data. This whole idea that, we know from the data, this idea that data are objective, if it's a number, it has no values, that kind of thing. You can easily reify the politics of the society that has selectively constructed the data itself. And that's been a problem that really is constant in the work we've done. And there are other ways it shows up. I'll give you an example. One of our recent studies looked at the relationship between lynching and corporal punishment in public schools. And schools are federally mandated to document their use of corporal punishment. This is the intentional use of pain to control behavior. Typically, there's things like paddling. But these data are very superficial. There's no qualitative information about the pain experience, the the ferocity, the sort of actual violence of the incident. And we know from anecdotes from school officials that they routinely underreport this because it's a bureaucratic hassle and probably there are other disincentives. So some estimates are maybe 50% of corporal punishment incidents. A kid gets slapped or their ear gets grabbed and twisted. Those are not part of the record that is being reported to the federal government. So what do you do with those kinds of problems is really an issue that shows up all the time. Generally speaking, the incidents were really, I'm interested in documenting better, including incidents of race-related political violence are underreported, are hidden. They're hard to find, and this is part of why the newspaper research has been very useful because typically there are reports in local newspapers about incidents that, but they aren't in, say, police or court records. So you can get to them through that. And of course, with all of the distortions, around them, like, well, this happened because this person did this heinous thing, and when in fact it was because they registered to vote or were deemed economically threatening. So there are all these distortions in the historical record. That's a real problem on the data side. And in fact, because I mentioned Ida B. Wells, I want to just go back to her and say one of the main contributions she made as an early social scientist using these data was to demonstrate empirically the lie that rapes were responses to sexual assault by black men. And she used the records themselves, the newspaper accounts that spoke about how people were targeted because they violated the racial etiquette. They weren't sufficiently deferential to whites, so they were competing too well. Those sorts of things. So there's really a long record of trying to deal with these data side problems, and I think the other in terms of the human, the person, the people side of it, a couple of issues really come to mind. One is the ethics of representation of these often very painful, difficult histories. What do you share, and how do you relay these stories in ways that are sensitive to the victims, their families and descendants, but also contemporary audiences? How do you represent this information in a way that is thoughtful? And similar to that, one of the reasons I stopped doing so much, I pivoted from focusing somewhat on documenting histories of racist violence and focused more recently on documenting, working with students to document anti-racist commemorative interventions. So I teach a class here called Monumental Anti-Racism, where the class is building a database. Every cohort is building examples globally, bringing into the database examples globally of commemorative interventions meant to counter systematic racism. And one of the reasons I did that, one is because I wanted to be able to study eventually whether these commemorative interventions, things like EJI's community remembrance projects or universities studying slavery or removals of Confederate monuments and those sort of things, what do they do? Do they mitigate the legacy of racial violence? Is a question I'm interested in, and there's really no good data to answer that question. So I thought, well, I'll just start just gathering stuff like I did back in my apartment. But working with students to do that. But one reason I pivoted was because I realized that the students I was working with to build the Racial Violence Archive over many years, this was mostly at UC Irvine, were suffering. I met one of the students I was working with one day. I just asked her, how are you doing? She talked about being really angry. And she was reading these records. One of the things they were doing was scraping manually, these printed reports by groups like various groups were keeping detailed records about atrocities that were happening in places around the country. And so the students were helping bring these into a database by manually entering the date and place and some information about what happened. And I just became more sensitive to the vicarious trauma that these students were subjected to through this work, and needing to be more thoughtful in, caring for them. And so I sort of just stopped, not knowing how to do that very well. I just sort of stopped doing that kind of research, approach, and it sort of languished. I know Molly. I keep looking at Molly because Molly and I. Well, no, because years right before the pandemic, I'd reached out to you about trying to figure out a better workflow for the Racial Violence Archive, and I have this assignment I've not completed yet that you and Doris gave me to do some recoding of something. But one of the reasons, but I've just sort of, but that human side of it has been, I think I feel numb to it. Maybe I'm just profoundly damaged already that I can't feel it anymore. But I just feel I'm sort of, for that reason and many others, like just it's so pervasive. Like, how do you really document this? I've stopped focusing as much on that.
So I'm going to combine the next couple of questions into, and I'm going to let you take this in the direction you'd like to take it. So the next couple of questions are around the management, the processing, and the analysis of your data. So if you faced issues with like storage or access with collaborators or with data quality, data wrangling, any of these issues that you face in that kind of grouping of things, you can talk about it as you like right now. And I'm looking at Rachel. Sure.
So this is a great question. Fortunately, so far, the data that we're collecting, both materially and in terms of bytes of data, it's manageable in terms of storage. We have not yet reached any sort of capacity. I know some colleagues in my department have tested the limits of data storage for the university and required some serious exciting innovations in terms of that capacity. We're sort of still, even with more molecular data, still in sort of the average range for biologists. But the data wrangling is really where I think the challenge is, especially if you use lots of different types of data. It's an ever something that always has to be assessed and reassessed. What's the optimal format for things to be? There are optimal formats for how something should be archived, and then there are sort of the optimal formats and storage locations for ease of use, and even how you code something in the data in a way that's going to be sensible later on for pairing it with some other data that you may or may not even have dreamed of yet. And so it's always an exciting challenge. It keeps us on our toes. But I always think back often to work that I did as a PhD student or postdoc. In both situations, I ended up several times. I ended up on projects where basically I was sent a whole bunch of different spreadsheets by one or more people as, here's some data that you might be interested in putting together. And they were, very disparate formats, sometimes really gnarly, stupid problems with Microsoft Excel in terms of date formats that we're all familiar with. But really interesting, issues of scale and issues of coding that had to be resolved. And I learned quite a lot from that experience. And so I, kind of vowed when I started my own lab that I would be, be very intentional about how data are stored in a standardized way, at least within our lab group. And that's, I think we've done a reasonable job of it, but it's something that you have to be really on top of as you bring more people into the group, students and postdocs and undergrads, that everyone is well trained in the best practices for that lab group. Otherwise, it's just an absolute headache. So, and we've tried to optimize our field data collection in different ways, and we've considered should we just be using tablets with drop-down menus. But honestly, I want there to be room for that element of like unexpected exploration, and the things that you scrawl in the margins of a field notebook are sometimes end up being the most exciting things that you then end up building something else on. And so a lot of our in the field data is still collected with paper and pencil, not pen, because if it gets wet, pencil doesn't run. And so we do have this step from raw data collection on paper and pencils. We do handwriting samples from all of the undergrads and high schoolers that work with us in the summer, because is that 2 a 1 or a 2? Is that a 4 or a 9? You don't want to have little things like that really mess you up. So, but we really do need that first type of data. I feel very strongly that having that paper and pencil option, either instead of or in addition to that initial digitized collection, is pretty important, because it gives you kind of space for thinking a little bit outside the box, in addition to the literal boxes that you're filling in. And so also you can't run out of batteries on a piece of paper. So, but I honestly forget what the prompt was at this point. I've just been rambling.
We were talking about what the challenges were with managing, processing, and analyzing. So you are actually right on track.
Yeah, and then from the analysis standpoint, in any subfield with in any of our fields, I'm sure, the advancement of analytical methods can be very fast, and it can be a challenge to keep on top of. But I like the sort of mantra to at least know what different techniques are capable of, and that helps point you towards which ones you should invest in learning or collaborating with somebody who knows even better. And so I try to at least stay current with the realm of possibility of different analytical techniques, and then figure out which seem like they're probably appropriate to what we're trying to do, and then learn enough about them that I feel confident that they're appropriate methodologically and interpretable towards what we want to interpret them for. But it's definitely something that is an evolving domain, the analysis of these different types of data, and I think it can be overwhelming if you assume that you have to learn all of the different methods yourself. I think the approach of being aware of them and then honing in on the ones that seem most relevant is the way to go.
Jeff, do you want to?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, my data collections are a mess, generally speaking, all of them, I think. One of the things, though, I should say, is a lot of the work, fortunately, I guess, at this point in my career, a lot of the stuff we've been collecting is not research-grade data. I mentioned the project with David and looking at North Carolina and Mississippi. We actually haven't published much on racial violence in other states because we aren't confident that our data are sufficiently representative of the distribution of events of racial violence in places like Missouri. But I do have a working file on Missouri and just about every other state, and I'm happy to share it with you if you'd like to see a messy spreadsheet. They're actually not that bad, but they're incomplete. And so I think our sense is that we need to do more on the ground archival work and more systematic going through monographs and so forth about specific state histories that would make us more confident that we can then engage in some kind of spatial analysis of the distribution of some phenomena like racial violence. So, you know, so there's a lot of challenge, you know, so that's a big data wrangling problem. Like how do we get a better record of racialized violence in Oregon, you know, for example, which we know exists. There's some examples here and there, but it hasn't been well documented. If you look at my Racial Violence Archive site, and then I was going to talk about the other challenge that I want to talk about is the public-facing part of it. You know, we have virtually nothing on the West. Not that there are no histories on the West, but the focus of this work historically, and to some extent still today, has been the southeastern United States, and to some extent the Midwest more recently. But there's been very little engagement until recently, you know, with things like anti-Mexican violence in the U.S. borderlands of the Southwest. My colleague, friend Monica Martinez has been doing work on that. Some others have been as well in Texas. In California, my home state, I mean, but these histories are so buried in parts of this country that you would really have to, and also there are issues around language diversity, for example, that would be important to deal with and to document things like anti-Chinese violence in parts of the U.S. or the Native American history. So there are a lot of issues around data gathering. The other thing I just wanted to mention in terms of a challenge is, I've been really committed to a kind of public-facing approach, engaging approach to this work. You know, going back to the origins with respect to the Mississippi meeting I mentioned, and wanting to really inform and encourage communities to reckon with these histories. So I've created these, I've learned a little bit about how to build digital maps and websites, and I've built these sites that share the material. And I try to, and that's where one of the places where some of the ethical questions come up. So I don't share details about events. The maps show counts at the county level, but they don't take people through all of the horrors of these events themselves. But but there are challenges there. One is, and I try to use disclaimers, we realize these are not comprehensive, do not treat these as comprehensive. If a county history, if it's blank, that only means we don't have a record of it, doesn't mean nothing happened. You should not use these data for research purposes, all these kinds of disclaimers. All that. But I just got an email, not just, but, I don't know, 5 years ago or maybe 2. I can't remember anymore the time. But I got an email from someone who said, hey, I just wanted you to let you know that I scraped your racial violence archive data off the internet, and I'm publishing this paper on the distribution of X or something, of this and that. Just wanted to let you know how useful your data was. And I'm like, you shouldn't do that. Didn't you read all my carefully worded disclaimers with the well-placed bold, So there are challenges to, sharing information that I think, come to mind in relation to the question.
Yeah. Ariella, I'm going to ask you to answer this one, and then I feel bound to let you have some time for questions, friends. Very little. And I'll tell you that the question that I am not going to ask, sadly, is about data sharing more broadly. But if you want to address it in your answer, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I think in some ways I haven't faced extreme data wrangling, sharing issues because of the types of data that I tend to work with. I do think so sociology is a discipline that values multiple methods, and my graduate training included both quantitative and qualitative methods, but and there is collaboration, but it is more of a solo model compared to a lab science model, in psychology or something like that. Even compared within the social sciences. And so I didn't get a lot of training in how to have a research team and how to do that kind of communication work. And as I've grown my my research agenda, as a faculty member, I've had to kind of just try to pick that up as I go. And there's certainly been some trial and error there in terms of best practices and I mean, even just like for myself, like I was on parental leave last semester, and then coming back now and like reopening old code files and trying to be like, what exactly was I thinking when I did this, right? And like, did I document it well enough to be able to pick this back up and smoothly hit the ground? And the answer is like, not really. And so figuring out all of that, how to, it's really important to me to include students in my research, but I've learned the hard way that I also have to, really carefully review, code and work that they produce, because they're still learning, right? And sometimes there's going to be mistakes, and that's a natural part of the process. But having really good systems in place to review that and catch it, and make sure that there aren't, downstream effects, is really important. And I'm honestly still working on figuring out how to do all of that in a more kind of systematic way.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I would love if you all had some questions for our panelists. They've said so many thoughtful and important things, and I'm sure I've seen some of you writing feverishly. So now is the time to ask the questions you want to know.
I'll start. I'll kick things off since I'm sitting in the front row here. First of all, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this because it's not often that that people have to come into like our realm and specifically talk about the stuff we deal with every day. So thank you so much for doing that. One thing that we haven't really touched on, Jeff, you mentioned it a little bit in your intro, which prompted me to want to ask you about this, is data visualization. So could you just each maybe talk about how the visualization of data fits into your research, maybe throughout the process, and then of course like when you're trying to share your findings? I don't know, Jeff.
Well, I'll just quickly say, I think for me, it's, I'm a visual person. I mean, this is why I think that making that timeline was like so helpful to me to sort of find new questions also, but so that's for me. I'm often wanting to see a spatial representation, and I do work. But a lot of my research is looking at place-based kinds of histories and legacies. So the mapping of the data is it was very helpful. The other thing I'll just say quickly is that I know from interactions with folks in public that the visualizations are often what bring people into the work. They aren't necessarily reading the article, but I think the maps are so powerful in part because it's no longer an abstract thing. People know places. They know the places they're from, the places they visited, and typically they don't know them in relation to the story that the data visualization is sharing, and that's a way into. I think it's really a way around some of the otherwise sort of ideological and other kinds of blocks that people will have. Oh, I don't want to talk about this as a topic, or so anyway. It's been very useful, just engaging audiences, I think.
So we, in my lab, we do a lot of different types of graphs of different types of biological data, as well as maps. And I agree, it's often the maps that I find most compelling. Since our data are inherently spatial, but maps that tell a story about environmental variation and a particular thing that we're studying, I find both fascinating and often spark new questions, because we do know some of the many different types of things that might also vary spatially in those same places. I feel like there was another thing I was going to add about maybe come back to me. I might have another.
So certainly the academic research that I'm producing includes plots of the, I'm usually typically using some kind of regression model to analyze data, and so I'll include visuals. They're meant for an academic audience. I have not done as much public-facing work. Like I think, relative to Jeff, that's definitely something I hope to be able to learn how to do better as I go forward in my career. But I think it's really important. You know, I mean, I teach the first class in our quantitative method sequence to our PhD students, and I spend a lot of time talking to them about how important it is to make their visualizations, you know, really clear and well labeled and interpretable, and about how, you know, someone should be able to look at just their figure and be able to understand what it's showing without reading, right, the text in their article or their paper or something like that. So it is something I take very seriously, but I think mostly for an academic audience, at least so far in my work.
Can I ask, does seeing the visualization for you, does it make you ask new questions, or do you feel like you already have those questions building without the visualization?
Oh, definitely. I mean, so like in my research process, I'm constantly plotting results as I go back and forth and iterate over the best model to use to show my results. A lot of what I'm often interested in are interactions among multiple variables, and you know, you can like look at that just as a set of coefficients in a model and in a table, but you have to like add different pieces together to figure out what the total effect and story is. And for me, even just my own like analysis process, visualizing that is often like pretty critical for me to understand what's really happening, and then figure, okay, now I've seen this pattern, like let me go back and, you know, run the model this way and see what that shows me. So it's definitely part of the process for me.
I would agree, and I remembered my other thing, that the maps can also be so critical for not just visualizing where your data are, but also where your data aren't. And Jeff, you reminded me of that in talking about, you know, what absence of data points mean. And, you know, in a system like ours, that may be that, you know, our particular organisms aren't there, or they're there, but they're not there at the times that we were observing them. And it's a really interesting problem and question to figure out where the absence of data means no one has looked there, and where it means something that's kind of more ecologically based in terms of a particular organism or phenomenon not occurring in that place.
Yeah, certainly for us, I mean, the visualizations have helped ask new questions, also interpret more effectively than without them. I'm thinking about, you know, with some new questions, you know, a lot of the maps of racial violence, for example, you know, you'll see these saturation areas that are these borderlands between states, you know, counties that are like Mississippi and Louisiana, neighboring counties that are hard to analyze, you know, in terms of the way the data are structured, but have become very clearly important to think about as clusters when you see them visualized. Another, a really probably extreme example, like David and I, you know, talking about, I think it was that Fuzzy Sets paper, but we did a study where we had data on, David has done all this work on the Ku Klux Klan, so he has all these crazy data sets, including like the Highway Patrol had collected license plate information from cars at Klan rallies in North Carolina, multiple rallies. So we had license plate data that we could then geolocate with the registered driver, the location of the registration. And so we had plotted where all the people attending these different rallies had come from around North Carolina, where the cars had come from. And there was this county in the center of the state that was, you know, represented, kind of overrepresented consistently across all the rallies, which, you know, we didn't notice from the database so well, and we hadn't asked the database to answer that question about outlier counties. But you could see it, and from there we were able to translate that. David said, realized that is a place that several of the organizers of the statewide Klan lived in that county, and so we were able to make sense of that, pattern in the data that was via the visualization, and also this, qualitative information he had about the organization of the Klan. So it's been really, it's certainly not just for display purposes. I mean, it's been certainly something that has been helpful in the research process itself.
I would love to invite you to ask another question, but we are over time, and I want to be respectful of our panelists and of you all. So can we please give them another round of applause? Thank you so much. It was a very wonderful presentation.